Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Schulich Leader Talks podcast. I'm Anita.
And I'm Rika.
And in this episode, we're going to talk about our experiences with grad school. Rika and I are both 2015 Schulich Leaders from UBC. I did my undergrad in physics and computer science, graduated in 2020, and then I did my master's in data science at Harvard. And after that, now I'm headed to start working as a data scientist at Meta.
I did my undergraduate degree in engineering physics and graduated at 2020 from UBC. And I just completed my master's degree in mechanical engineering at MIT. And I plan to stay for the PhD program as well.
Right. So I think before we jump into talking about our experiences applying to and going to grad school, maybe we should just start by talking about why we even decided to go to grad school. So yeah, how was that like for you, Rika?
For me, throughout my undergraduate years, I did some research internships where I got to experience a little bit of the research side and also interact with a lot of graduate students, master's students and PhD students, and even postdocs and other research scientists as well. And through interacting with them, I was really inspired by how knowledgeable they were in their area and how they took the time to really understand the fundamentals of the problems they were solving. And so, yeah, that was really inspiring and motivational and led me to decide to apply to grad school. Why did you decide to apply to grad school, Anita?
Yeah, so when I started undergrad, I was already kind of planning on going to grad school, but in physics. So I was really interested in physics and wanted to do work in experimental physics and do grad school in that area. So I ended up doing a lot of internships in doing research in physics. But through those internships, I was also doing a lot of computational and machine learning work for my research. And that kind of introduced me to the area. And I would say by the end of my third year is when I kind of switched and got more interested in doing computational work. And I wanted to do experience kind of research in computer science. And also I was interested in applying to data science jobs and research and development jobs in industry. And a lot of these positions, from my experience, they either preferred or required having at least a master's degree. So it was, for me, gaining research experience in computer science and also gaining sort of those skills and qualifications for the jobs that I was interested in. And yeah, so I would say spring, summer of 2019 is when I started looking into graduate programs for sort of in computing, yeah, and started prepping for the GREs and prepping materials that summer, which, yeah, speaking of the GREs, maybe we can like talk a little bit about sort of the application process for grad schools. At the time, for schools in the US, I had to do the GREs. I applied to schools in US and Canada. Canadian schools didn't require that, but from my experience, even the US schools are changing now. So at Harvard, I know the engineering school no longer requires any GRE scores. What about for you? What did you only apply to schools in the US or?
For me, I applied to a few schools in the US and also in Europe, specifically in Switzerland. And most programs required GRE. There was one, the MIT Media Lab did not, and it sounds like the mechanical engineering department is also placing less of an emphasis on the GRE scores. So it depends really on the program and the university.
Mhm. Yeah, and then other than the GREs, I would say the other components that I had to put in my application, I would say is fairly standard in at least the US and Canada. I had to provide my transcript and my CV, and then also a statement of purpose, and then three reference letters. Some places allowed to attach a couple extra ones, like up to 4 or 5, but usually, yeah, pretty much everybody requires at least having three reference letters. So yeah, was that also similar for you? Like, what was the timeline for you of what sort of materials did you have to prepare, and when did you start preparing them?
Yeah, it was very similar for me. So I started studying for the GREs in the summer, um, before my final year in undergrad, and that fall in September I took the GREs, and yes, from there I started preparing my applications, which included the letter of intent or statement of purpose, usually 2 pages of why you're applying to grad school and what you'd like to research or what you'd like to get out of grad school. And then, like you mentioned, Anita, the recommendation letters. So I reached out to my internship supervisors, 2 of them, and then I also reached out to the program director at UBC as I was looking for someone to give some perspective on my academic performance as well as research performance in the internships. Yeah, who did you contact for your letter of recommendations?
Yeah, so I was pretty worried, I would say, for the letters of recommendation because I was applying to schools for like computer science, machine learning related programs, but most of my sort of research and like internship experiences were in physics. And it depends, I guess, on the program, but I would say there's quite a high demand for machine learning related yeah, grad programs. So I was worried that maybe yeah, not having references directly in that field would be a problem. But I would say, at least for master's programs, it's not as big of a problem because I do think that a chunk of like people who do apply to master's programs are people looking to sort of get started in a new field that maybe they didn't necessarily focus on doing their undergrad. So I ended up, because I was applying to research master's programs, which I guess maybe that's also a point to bring up. We both, I believe, applied to research master's programs, but there are sort of industry or professional master's programs where they don't do a thesis in research. But yeah, because mine was a research focused program, I wanted to have a few at least references that could comment on my skills and experiences in research and also my academics. So one of my references was my supervisor from an NSERC position I did, which was a particle physics research, but I was doing a lot of sort of computational work and machine learning work in that field. So that was to give like a view of my experiences with research and maybe a little bit of computing as well. And then I had one of my professors that I took 2 courses with and who was familiar with me, which I think is really important, making sure that your reference letter writers are familiar with you beyond just you attending their courses and getting good grades, because that's pretty much everyone. No one's gonna like have like a professor that doesn't have like a good view of them. You really want to make sure that the professor knows you beyond just the class. And then, yeah, the last one was my only, I would say, non-academic reference, which was one of my supervisors from an industry internship that I did. And but that was in sort of research and development in a tech company. So I thought that would be a good person to give a perspective of like my technical skills and kind of some sort of research like environment in computing. Yeah, so that's who I ended up asking for my references. Yeah.
How early on did you ask for references?
Yeah, so I kind of I think I asked them all sort of late October, which is maybe a bit late from what I've asked other people. Generally, people recommend that we sort of ask the reference letter writers 3 months in advance, just because maybe sort of they might not be like the person you first reach out to, maybe they might not be comfortable writing a reference letter, or maybe they're busy at the time. You want to make sure you have a buffer to ask other people, or like give them time to actually write a good reference letter for you. Yeah. Yeah, I would say definitely 3 months or so in advance would be ideal. Yeah, so I think maybe we can now talk a little bit about the statement of purpose, because I think that's something that people might not be familiar with. This is not something you would traditionally write for an application to undergrad programs. So yeah, do you want to give an overview, like sort of maybe some advice you have, and also what should be included in a statement of purpose?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. When I started writing, I looked at resources online, and specifically the career office at the undergrad or at UBC. They had nice guidelines and resources on what to include, and things like your experiences and skills you've learned through, whether it's research at school or internships. That's something you really want to highlight in the statement of purpose, and also why you're interested in the program you're applying to. And if you are applying to a research master's or graduate school focused on research, it's also good to mention the specific professors and the labs you would like to work in. And those are the things you would generally like to highlight, and maybe not so much the courses and grades, which are already included in other parts of your application. Yeah, what would you say, Anita? Am I missing anything?
Yeah, I would definitely agree that that's like the general things that you want to include. Yeah, I kind of had this template that I set up where I was talking essentially about sort of expanding on those research experiences that I had in my CV, expanding on that, and also explaining my particular areas of interest in research, and why I was just interested in these specific areas. And I pretty much kept those paragraphs the same in all of my applications. And then I had this, I would say 1 or 2 paragraphs at the end, which were school specific, program specific. That's where I was talking about sort of why was I even interested in applying to this program at this specific school, sort of what are some professors that I might be interested in working with for research. Yeah, and that was what I was essentially changing between my applications to the different schools. And yeah, definitely in terms of resources, I probably didn't make good use of some of the resources in university, like that we had at our university, but I did use some online resources like blogs, and there are like people who are professors even, or like used to be on a grad committee, application committee. So, and they have sort of their experiences. They've shared it online on sort of what they expect in these statements of purpose. And I found that very helpful for me. And something else I found helpful was just having people read through, like my professors also to give me sort of a perspective of, okay, is there something that I'm missing or I need to add or maybe change it structurally? And then I also had like friends read through my statement of purpose just to, you know, catch those little grammar mistakes and stuff, which I don't know, like I had to go through my drafts multiple times and make multiple edits after reading it a bunch of times. You become immune to all of the little mistakes you're making. So yeah.
Oh yeah, totally. I had like version 6, 7 of my statement of purpose. And so yes, it's a lot of reading and iterating and reviewing. So I'd also recommend getting other people to read. And I'll come back to this point again, that the University Career Office or Writing Center, they usually have resources to help students, including people there to review your letters and give you feedback. And so I definitely recommend checking them out, making appointments with them to sit down and go through your application before submitting.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think maybe let's switch gears a little bit from sort of the application now to sort of the costs of grad school and sort of finding funding for that, because that's also important. You want to make sure you're able to fund your however many years it is you're spending in grad school. So maybe I'll give like a little bit of a perspective on the Canadian schools. So just to, I guess, clarify, there's like two different types of master's programs. There's like research masters, and then there's the industry and or like professional masters, which I didn't actually end up applying to any of the industry master's programs, but as far as I know, in Canada, all of the research master's programs are funded with a stipend that comes from the sort of the professor that you're working with and the school. It's nothing like huge, but it covers like your day-to-day needs, and there's also, they cover, in addition to that, they also cover your tuition. Whereas with industry master's programs, there isn't any guaranteed funding or stipend. You can, I think, apply for some scholarships that the school might offer or externally. But yeah, that's something that you would have to apply for, usually separately. I'm not sure if there's any sort of national scholarships for that purpose. Like for the research masters, I do know NSERC also has these graduate scholarships available, which you can apply for. Essentially, you just apply through the NSERC website. You list the schools that you're interested in applying to, and if you get into school in those schools, the schools review your application for NSERC as well, and then you can get that extra funding from NSERC, which it's a nice thing to top up the sort of stipend that you get from the school, because usually those stipends that you get from school, that is in exchange for your work as like a research assistant or a teaching assistant, and then you can have sort of a reduced load of your teaching assistantship work if you have the NSERC to sort of balance that out, and you can focus more on your research. But then in terms of the US schools, so originally I wasn't even planning on applying to US schools because from what I read online, mostly US schools, the master's programs are not funded. And so given that, I wasn't really planning on applying to any US schools originally, but looking into it a bit more, there are sort of some specific programs or like schools or professors that might offer funding for like a specific project that they have that they want maybe a master's student to work on. So that's something that requires a little bit more sort of specific research into these specific programs in schools to find out which one of them are have sort of funding for a project or like a program that is funded. And then there's of course like some fellowships and scholarships that we can apply to either externally or like fellowships that are specifically from the school itself. Like, for example, at Harvard, I applied to a fellowship. It's called the Frank Knox Memorial Fellowship, and they had a few fellowships available for students coming to Harvard from Canada specifically, and that had a completely separate application I had to complete in the November of the same year that I was applying. Yeah, and there are, though, I believe some other, Harvard also has some other scholarships or financial aid packages that you automatically get considered for with your application as well. Yeah. So what about your experiences with the US schools? Did you also find that most of them weren't sort of providing funding?
Yeah, I found what you covered it very well. Most schools for masters require you to pay the tuition. But there were a few programs, and those were the programs I applied to where they did have funding for you for your research masters, and MIT was one of them. The funding, similar to the Canadian schools, comes from research assistantships, where the lab would pay you from their grant money to conduct research, or you would be a teaching assistantship and work as a TA to help with courses. And that way you would get your tuition covered, and then you'll get a stipend that's enough to cover your living costs. There's also an option to get fellowships and scholarships, like many other schools. And that helps a lot, because then you're not tied to the funding source. You can choose the lab you want to work with without having to worry about whether they have money to support you. And you also don't have to worry about teaching as well, and focus really on the research. As for Europe, I think usually for masters, you are required to pay a tuition, but it's also much lower than what's required in Canada, and especially in the US, or sorry, in Canada, you're not required for masters to pay tuition, but in the US, it can go up to 30K for a year of tuition, whereas in Europe, at least at ETH Zurich, which I applied to that year, it was around 700 Swiss francs, which is around 700 US dollars per year. So comparatively more affordable. And over there too, in Europe, there are still, again, opportunities to be a research assistant and have some income to support yourself as well.
Yeah, and I would say the other thing to consider as well is that you want to also make sure that you have funding for not just to cover the tuition, but to plan for funding for just your living expenses as well, right? Yeah, so making sure that you're applying to fellowships that cover your full sort of stay there, your living expenses as well as your tuition, or if like one fellowship doesn't cover that, you want to make sure you have plans for the other expenses that come with just living in a different city. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe we can now talk a little bit about just the general our experiences with grad school. So for me, at Harvard, my program was 2 years long, although there is sort of a professional master's version of the same program as well, where the students don't have to do a thesis anymore, and that one is 1.5 years long. But for mine, which did have a thesis option, the first year I was primarily focused on the courses. There's a set of sort of core courses and electives that I had to take for my master's, which mostly I took that in my first year. Also, with my program, when I got admitted, it wasn't like I was matched to a specific PI from the beginning. It was like a general admission. And then during my first year, I had the opportunity to like talk to different professors in the department and different advisors to see if like who would like sort of what research projects they had available and like who would be interested in advising me. So that was sort of my first year. For me specifically, I had a project in mind that I wanted to do for my thesis. So I reached out to some professors that had overlapping areas of interest in research, and finally I found an advisor to work with me. And then my second year was all primarily focusing on doing my research and thesis. And I did do a couple more courses as well. And then I also spent one semester doing TFing, which in Harvard, that's like teaching fellow, which is the equivalent of like a teaching assistant in some other schools. Yeah, and which that wasn't required. That was just me wanting to like experience the teaching fellowships at Harvard. And yeah, so that was pretty much the overall experience for me. What about you? How long was your program and how was it like?
Yes, the mechanical engineering master's program is typically 2 years, and it's a mix of courses and research. So when you get admitted in April, like you, Anita, I wasn't matched with a lab or a PI, and we were asked to find an advisor that you wanted to work for and a lab you wanted to work with. And so over the spring and the summer, I reached out to professors and students to ask them about the lab and what research they're doing. And once you get matched with a lab, starting September, you would be starting your master's thesis research. And so for 2 years, you're conducting research while filling the course requirements, usually taking 1 or 2 classes per semester. And yeah, really working on the research on the side. I hear that it depends a lot on the program as well. Even within MIT, like some programs are more like yours, Anita, where they take courses in the first year. They might even do lab rotations for a semester where for each month, they get to visit a different lab and see what kind of research they do and help, experience the research before choosing a lab. So those are different flavors you can get.
And for the courses, was that like a set of required courses, or did you have the option to kind of pick among several set of
So again,
courses?
It depends on the program. In our program, we were free to choose whatever courses we'd like to take, except for one math requirement. I know other programs where when they're more PhD oriented, so it's like a direct PhD program where you can enter and start the PhD program from just having a bachelor's degree. Those programs may have specific course requirements. Yeah.
And about the sort of talking with the PI, so you said that you actually started your research from the very first year. So because I did my first year, and then while I was at Harvard, I was talking to the PIs, but I guess you started talking to them before you even started like school in September at MIT. So did you go to MIT? Like, was there a program set in place to go to MIT beforehand once you get accepted?
Yeah, I think it's very common in the US to have open houses where you get to go visit the university for a few days a week. And usually they'll introduce you to the program. And there you'd have opportunities to visit labs and talk to professors. In my case, everything was virtual, but still we had a chance to talk to professors over Zoom. And also after those open houses, we were encouraged to reach out by email to schedule meetings and talk to professors. And also definitely talk to students when you have to make this decision. It's really, really helpful to get their view on what the lab culture is like, what the professor's advising style is like, in order to find a good fit, because that's also really important um, for you to enjoy the experience as well.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree. Like in terms of research, your advisor in the lab environment is one of the most important parts of for you to be able to enjoy the research and like gain a lot of valuable experiences from that. And then the other one, of course, is your own interest in the particular project and the area. So maybe we can talk a little bit now about just the research experience itself, since we both did like a research master's program. Like, what was your experience doing graduate research, and like what is some advice you have?
Yes, for me, the lab I was accepted in had, the professor already had a research project in mind for me. It was from a PhD student who was just finishing up his PhD, who had a few projects left over for people to carry on, and I took on one of them. And so there was a very clear already research question and an idea of how next steps and how they wanted to move forward. That was really nice because I got to work with this PhD student, and he was really a mentor to me, helping me get started with the research, giving me background readings to do, and being available for any questions I had, to discuss problems and also always discuss next steps and how to move forward. Um, and that was very helpful, especially because my advisor was a little more hands-off. And so we didn't have weekly one-on-one meetings. I had to reach out to him by email to schedule meetings. And so sometimes having other students around to be able to talk to problems and discuss was really helpful as I started my graduate studies. What was your experience like, Anita?
Yeah, so mine was a little bit different. Like I mentioned, I ended up doing a project that I had in mind myself. So it wasn't something that the PI had like sort of plans for. Like there wasn't really like a baseline there for me. So I kind of had to start from scratch. And part of the other part of it was that because it was a project that like I had proposed myself, it wasn't something that like my PI had funding for himself. So I also had to, for some of the experiments that I wanted to run, I had to like apply to some fundings separately to fund the experiments. So yeah, also I would say, like you were saying, having students in the lab who have some experience with the project or like something similar, I would say, is definitely helpful. And that was something that maybe my experience lacked a little bit, because there weren't any other students that worked on it before. I had to kind of set up everything from scratch, and then when there were any technical roadblocks, things maybe took longer than they should have. So yeah, definitely I would say having other students in the lab who have some prior familiarity with the project or something similar is a great asset to have, because the PIs, really the professors that are advising you, they're really kind of like project managers. That, if like people are familiar with like working in industry, they're really project managers. They're not there to be as hands-on and like help you with any technical roadblocks or challenges. They're there to kind of guide the general sort of path and like help guide you in the right direction research wise. Yeah, so I would say that was the biggest difference for my particular experience doing research. But I would say, because it was a project that I had pitched, it did give me, on the other hand, a little bit more freedom of like sort of what I want to do and like what direction I want to take it. Yeah. Um, yeah, so I think that's all we have for today. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I hope that the listeners find this useful as well. Thank you everyone for listening, and bye.
Bye-bye.